Morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the kind introduction. And yes, I'm here to learn, really. And I appreciate that I'm talking to an audience who will be much more knowledgeable in lots of areas than I am, but I hope my little bit of a specialism might be of interest. I'm really disappointed to discover that if I'd waited a couple more years, I could have got a steam train down to Leicester instead of coming on the more ordinary train. But yes, I'm looking forward to the discussions and the activities of today and what I'll learn from them. And I hope I can bring a few slightly different angles from which to approach nuclear issues that will be of interest. So a little bit of background about me. I had a long career in academia, but I'm now a freelance writer and researcher. My subject background is in English literature, and I taught across the curriculum. But my specialist area of research and teaching is the culture, mostly the literature, but also the film, music, and much more besides, of the nuclear age. I'm interested in how literature responds to the profound changes wrought by the nuclear technologies, particularly but not exclusively the bomb, and how those have been reflected in and shaped by the stories that we tell about them. So my first big project on the topic, States of Suspense, I worked on American fiction up until the early 2000s, exploring how consciousness of living in a state of suspense before potential nuclear futures affected society and culture. My second project, or big project, was about the 1980s as a nuclear decade. There's been quite a lot of work done on the 1950s and American culture, much less on the culture of the 1980s, which was just as significant as a nuclear decade. And I looked there at intersections between nuclear, environmental, feminist protest and other issues in the 80s. And I'm currently working, as Martin said, on a book about the literature set in and around Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was designed and built. So I'll say a little bit about that later on, but not much. But I'm also interested in fostering creative responses. And of course, as activists, you are storytellers in lots of ways. You'll be used to telling stories and engaging with people whose stories about the world are perhaps different to your own. And the latest project was a lovely bridge between academia and life outside academia. I had an email about a year ago from a property developer, and working on nuclear issues, you sometimes get some rather kind of strange emails that pop into your inbox. And this person said, I bought a nuclear bunker. Would you be interested in having a look round? And I really was. In Nottingham, as a lot of you will know, Nottingham in the early 60s was designated as a regional seat of government in the event of nuclear war. And the bunker, which is only a couple of miles from the city centre, which strikes me as probably not a great place for a nuclear bunker, the bunker would have housed over 400 people, and it's just been left abandoned for decades. It's been used as storage and things, and it's going to be redeveloped into somewhere which is going to become a community hub, which is rather lovely. It's going to come from this kind of place of last redoubt against the worst of all possible futures to something that's more kind of creative and a place where people might meet and create things. But before that happened, I had the opportunity to take some writers and historians and a podcaster with my colleague Sarah Jackson round the bunker in June, and we had a writing workshop. And some of the work that they produced out of that, we very hurriedly produced with a book we're really, really proud of, really, because our writers just put so much effort into something that wasn't going to give them any, or us indeed, any money. But people like John McGregor, some of you may know, the novelist, poet Sarah Jackson, and others, just reflecting on this space in what we thought about as a creative archive. So I'm kind of interested in, I suppose I'm a literary critic, but I'm also interested in what new creative responses we might produce. And I guess my work proceeds from two starting points. First of all, that we are a storytelling species, and that language and literature is fundamental to how we make sense of the world. And understanding those ways of understanding the world tells us something about society, culture, and history, about who we are and about the directions in which we're going. Second, and I appreciate this is an obvious point, but sometimes remembering obvious things is a useful thing to do. Technology is always cultural, and so as well as being materially potent, it shapes how we know the world and how we make sense of the world. It's not just kind of out there and separate to us, it becomes part of how we see the world and mediate the world. And I think this is particularly significant in the case of nuclear weapons. I should say that the next slide is as exciting as my animations get, so you better make the most of this. It's particularly important in the case of nuclear weapons because not only are they potentially so consequential for our world, but they also carry a heavier symbolic weight than other technologies. The word nuclear carries complex associations. By engaging with the multiple, often disturbing, occasionally wonderful, we might think about nuclear medicine, implications of nuclear technologies, literature ends up exploring long-standing and fundamental questions about ourselves and our world in new ways. Rather than talking specifically about the projects that I described earlier on, and which I'm happy to return to in questions, I thought I'd take you through a few perspectives on nuclear literature. So I've gone for a kind of quick dip into lots of different things, and we can return to some of those in more detail later on. This is a cartoon from Private Eye magazine from a couple of years ago, 6 months or so after the invasion of Ukraine. And I guess it captures something of how people, what people think of when you say the word nuclear to them. And I quite like how its humour plays, although I'm kind of disturbed by it as well, with the slot that used to be at the end of ITN News, where possibly apocryphally, Trevor McDonald or whomever would say, and finally, and would introduce a light-hearted piece about, I don't know, skateboarding dogs or something. And here, and finally, is something else. And the and finally is something that means the end of all news, the end of everything. And I guess what people think about, when people think about depictions of the nuclear age in literature, they might think, first of all, about post-apocalyptic narratives of nuclear war and its aftermath. And there are indeed some very good, as well as some not very good, novels imagining the aftermath of nuclear war. But I'm not going to talk about those today. I'm happy to chat about some of my favourites and your favourites, and those that you find most useful later on. Rather, I thought I'd start with a couple of writers' responses to living in a world that's nuclear. When the great American novelist William Faulkner stood up to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in Stockholm in December 1950, he feared that literature and the ability to tell stories would be stymied by the new nuclear world in which humans found themselves. Of course, just 5 years before, the US had dropped the first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Only months before, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic weapon. Our tragedy today, he said, is a general and universal fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Outside, at the other end of the Cold War, the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, who'd not long before won the Booker Prize for her book, The God of Small Things, responded to nuclear testing by India and Pakistan at a moment of heightened tension over Kashmir, to speak of nuclear war and fear of nuclear war as potentially the, quote, end of imagination. As a writer, she said, there's nothing new or original to be said about nuclear weapons. There can be nothing more humiliating for a writer of fiction to do than restate a case that has, over the years, already been made passionately, eloquently, and knowledgeably. Despite the fears they express, both Faulkner and Roy go on to write eloquently and movingly about writing in or in spite of a nuclear context. And of course, literature has done just fine in the nuclear age. But it's also worth saying that there is, in fact, an extraordinarily rich and diverse array of nuclear literature, and that it's a literature that does more than narrate the possibility of an apocalyptic ending. And we might think about kind of alternative futures that we might think about, less apocalyptic futures. To illustrate the richness of this literature, I'm going to skim extremely quickly through a few slides from my current project about the literature, film and music of the Los Alamos Project, just to kind of give you a sense of the generic diversity and the diversity of approaches to those very few years in the mid-1940s when the Manhattan Project was running, and particularly focused on Los Alamos, of course, where the bomb was built. So for this project, I've identified so far about 50 texts, and they include historical fiction, literary fiction, works by kind of what you might call local writers, regional writers. Leslie Marmon Silko's sort of telling of the story of the Manhattan Project from the Pueblo nations just outside Los Alamos is a really interesting one, I think. Also thrillers, poems and poetry collections, children's and young adult, science fiction and graphic novels, children's and young adult fiction. The Green Glass Sea is particularly terrific of those, a very intriguing depiction for teenagers of the creation of the bomb. Television series and films, most familiarly, I guess, last year's film Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan, and also stage plays and even operas, John Adams's Dr. Atomic. Collectively, what all these works do is investigate and explore the troubled and troubling birth of the atomic bomb and its consequences. I go so far as to say that the way in which this moment is dealt with turns it into, and I'm not sure this is necessarily a good thing, into a kind of mythology of the nuclear age. I think this was clear. I quite like Nolan's film Oppenheimer, but I think it kind of participates in that mythologizing of that process where the story becomes about Oppenheimer's tragedy rather than a tragedy elsewhere. But it's also a story of people going into the desert, seeing a revelation of power. There is a long-standing cultural tradition of how those kind of stories are told. So there's a kind of origin story which is contested, worked over, reworked. In some of these works, very, very brilliantly, I'd have to say, and very thought-provokingly. So anyway, there is a rich literary tradition. That's just one example of one moment that's been presented. One of the ways in which I think it's useful to think about nuclear literature as a whole is as something that not only raises consciousness about nuclear issues, but also draws attention to how nuclear contexts can rework and rethink, or end up provoking how we rework and rethink key things. So I've broken these into three categories. And I think about how in lots of nuclear novels and plays and poems, ideas of place and space are problematized, ideas of time and history are challenged, and ideas of identity and being are reworked. So I'll talk in the remainder of the talk. I'll just talk through each of these in turn very briefly, give a couple of examples, put some examples of literary works up on the screen, and little bits of text that we might discuss. But I'll only be able to dip into one or two of these things in detail, and other bits I'll pass over more quickly. So to begin with then with nuclear geographies and nuclear spaces. There are particular environments, I think, that recur as symbolic environments in nuclear literature. The city, the idea of the city and how that changes in the nuclear age, particularly post-Hiroshima. The idea of the home and the shelter. If you look at civil defense pamphlets and these sorts of things, they're all focused on the suburban home, because inner cities' homes probably wouldn't survive. And of course, the Earth and the ecosystem and what binds us together globally in the face of a nuclear threat. So I'll just look at those. I'll just look at the city today and then move on. So Hiroshima is, I suppose, is our text in lots of ways, or is the text for the nuclear age in lots of ways. As a historian, Paul Boyer has said, it's the epicenter of the nuclear age. It provides a template by which we understand what that age could presage. And of course, our visions of atomic war come from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but those visions of atomic war don't really give us an idea of what a nuclear war would now mean in the age of the hydrogen bomb and of more bombs. The journalist Tom Vanderbilt has gone further, arguing that what it means to live in a city, how urban life is imagined, changed following Hiroshima, at least during the Cold War. Over every city, he wrote, hovered the after-image of the dead city. And of course, the bombing of urban populations was established before the atomic bomb. You might think of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War, and of course London, Coventry, Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo in the Second World War. But I think there is something particularly terrifying about the kind of equation of one bomb and one city. And thinking about city spaces and thinking of sort of cities as the primary targets of nuclear weapons is something, of course, that people have seized on in order to contest their continuation. So from just up the road, not far by steam train in Nottingham, this is from by a pamphlet by the Medical Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons from 1983. And you can see there's this sort of vision of the city from above, almost as a target. It's a way of asking people to reimagine the space in which they live, and a kind of terrifying vision of what the future might be. This is another one from, this was published in the same month that the BBC's Threads first screened by Sheffield City Council and other nuclear-free zone councils in Yorkshire, and imagines Sheffield and other areas damaged by nuclear war. So this sense of the city as a threatened environment is articulated very powerfully in some nuclear literature. So let's turn to some of that. So this is Toge Sankichi. The family name is Toge. The family name comes first in Japan. Who is one of the Hibakusha, one of the survivors of the nuclear war, and writes very powerfully about the experience and the legacy of Hiroshima. And this is an excerpt from the poem, it's not the whole poem. No longer are we what we used to be ourselves, but other beings, with our own bodies still, but with a burning stink. With peeled skins, bald heads we go, branded with all the marks of the atomic tribe. I'll come back to that phrase, the atomic tribe, later in the talk. Humans bereft of the right to live as humans. Now even a test on some lagoon in the furthest reaches of the ocean makes us jump, for we know each bomb is hanging on its parachute of blackness over our melting pot. And then the poem ends, watch how these voiceless fires stream through all the earth to bring a blazing Hiroshima to London, a blasting Hiroshima to New York, an incandescent Hiroshima to Moscow. So this idea of the Hiroshima becoming the template for other cities is explored here by Toge in ways which I think are very powerfully articulate the anxieties that he had. I think he died in 1953, so not that long after the Second World War, but wrote some very moving poems about Hiroshima after the bomb, as well as the experience of the bomb as well. And Toge's vision of the blast and heat of the atomic weapon is kind of one way in which these environments are imagined. But also the urban environments are also imagined in other and more subtle ways as well. This is from John Herz's magnificent piece of journalism, Hiroshima, which several of you will know, I'm sure, or perhaps all of you. Perhaps one of the great works of 20th century journalism. First published as an article in the New Yorker in 1946 and still available in print as a book now. And here, one of the survivors whom Hersey interviewed, Miss Sasaki, is taken back through the city on a stretcher a few weeks after the attack. And this is just this passage is preceded by a scene in which another survivor, Father Kleinsorger, goes back, and we get this image of the flattened city and those very kind of those images that we might be familiar with from the photographs of Hiroshima. But this passage, I think, introduced perhaps the environmental threat of radioactive contamination very intriguingly. This was the first chance Miss Sasaki had had to look at the ruins of Hiroshima. There was something she noticed about it that particularly gave her the creeps. Over everything, up through the wreckage of the city, in gutters, along the riverbanks, tangled among tiles and tin roofing, climbing on charred tree trunks, was a blanket of fresh, vivid, lush, optimistic green. The verdancy rose even from the foundations of ruined houses. Weeds already hid the ashes, and wild flowers were in bloom among the city's bones. The bomb had not only left the underground organs of plants intact, it had stimulated them. And I think it's interesting what happens here, because on first reading, this feels like a kind of familiar story of warfare and death and rebirth. We've got new things growing in the city. And there is indeed, it's a lush, optimistic green. But also something has changed here very profoundly. Miss Sasaki isn't given hope by this. She's given the creeps by it. She's given the creeps. And then also there's this line at the end. Hersey, on the ship back from Hiroshima, had been reading a work of Japanese physicists about the impact of radioactivity on plants. And he says, I don't think he can quite prove that these plants are growing in great profusion, in seemingly unnatural profusion, because of radioactivity. But he kind of implies it here. I mean, it could be just the horrific, the fact that there is lots of open space and there is an open sky to grow towards might have been part of it. But he says the bomb had not only left the underground organs of plants intact, it had stimulated them. And we get this sense of a kind of environmental discourse, I think, coming here. Hersey wouldn't have conceived of it in those words, those terms, I don't think. But this sense of the familiar becoming strange, of nature somehow being disrupted by the presence of the bomb. And what we see here in Miss Sasaki's reaction, this sense that she can't quite put her finger on why she feels uncomfortable, but she feels uncomfortable, is a manifestation of what the anthropologist from the University of Chicago, Joseph Masco, has described as a phenomenon of the nuclear uncanny. Masco takes the idea of the uncanny from Freud, but thinks about amongst other things, the ways in which people respond to nuclear materials, events and phenomena, to radioactivity, and about how it haunts the imagination and how it shapes the imagination and renders the familiar strange. So the uncanny is stories of the uncanny are often stories of people with doppelgangers or of dolls coming to life, of a kind of an unsettling lifefulness of things that we would normally think of as dead or as not living. And he says, the radiation's very invisibility allows its proliferation in the realm of the imagination. So one of the things I'm interested in is how literature writes about things like radiation, to this thing that you can't see, you can't hear, you can't smell, that evades the senses. And that sort of approach that Hersey takes we find cropping up in lots of places elsewhere. This is from a novel by Maggie G in the 1980s. Maggie G wrote a couple of really great books on nuclear issues. One, The Burning Book, is terrific. I really recommend that to you. But her novel Grace is about a woman living in Kent, and the book starts with her hearing news from Chernobyl, of the nuclear disaster at the power plant there. Unconfirmed reports abnormally high, over 100 times in Sweden, the radio said. Grace was at home. It seemed such a long way away. Grace was 85. She lived in the country. The tulips were blinding sunshine yellow. Next day, the reports were confirmed. There was no really to hide, because air is everywhere and goes everywhere. Air from the inner city, air from the chemical plants, air from Russia that spring. Grace had tried to understand, in the wind that was shaking the creeper, in the April rain and sun, through curtains, windows, walls, and her thin hand pressed to the window pane, through flesh and blood and bone it fell. Yet part of her didn't believe it. It couldn't be seen or heard or tasted. The ordinary senses let one down. Was it really there then, the radiation, that nervous whispering spring? Was it in the ordinary green leaves and the ordinary milk at breakfast? I think there's a strong sense in which Grace's sense of place at home is troubled here. That even if the radioactivity from the Chernobyl disaster isn't in her house, it's in her mind, and that it's changing how she thinks about the world. It's in her body, possibly, or possibly not. So there's this sense of being, one's own body being made alien through through its permeability, or consciousness of its permeability. And of course, we know that our bodies are permeable. We know we eat and we excrete and we're affected by the sun, etc., etc., etc. But yes, we, or at least I, kind of think of myself as a self-contained little unit. And this suggests, well, actually, we're not self-contained little units. We're connected to ecosystems, to places far, far away. And it's a reaction to nuclear phenomena that goes way back before we might think of the nuclear age as having started, incidentally. This is the very first X-ray image taken by William Röntgen, the physicist, German physicist. And the first X-ray was a picture of his wife's hand. And of course, we're used to diagnostic X-rays now, and we're familiar with them, and they don't seem particularly disturbing. But his wife understandably said, "I have seen my own death." You know, this sense of the permeability of the body. And I think that's one of the anxieties that nuclear literature deals with in many ways. And that leads us on to, away from nuclear geographies and places, I suppose. We've ended up on nuclear identities or subjectivities, ways in which we're subject to the experience of living in a nuclear age. You know, an obvious starting point is to come back to Japan and to think about the figure of the hibakusha, the Japanese term for the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks. And Robert Lifton, the American psychiatrist, worked with survivors of the atomic attack, and his book Death in Life, I mean, it's an old book now, but I think is interesting for the sense in which people's sense of self was changed by, for those who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was changed by that. Exposure to the atomic bomb, he wrote, changed the survivor's status as a human being in his or her own eyes as well as in others. He became a member of a new group. He assumed the identity of the hibakusha. And it sort of makes me think back to the line from Togei's poem that I read out earlier, The Marks of the Atomic Tribe. And I suppose we might ask whether the atomic tribe, are these people who are survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Are we as a species an atomic tribe after 1945, or after whichever sort of starting point you want to give for the nuclear age? And being a hibakusha might make one different because one is sick with radiation sickness, but also because of the constrained economic and social opportunities that hibakusha faced, their changed sense of self. A lot of hibakusha found it difficult to get employment, either because they were suffering the effects of radiation sickness or because employers thought that they might suffer the effects of radiation sickness. A lot of hibakusha found it hard to form romantic relationships because people suspected that they might be incapable of having healthy children. So there's a kind of physical dimension to being a hibakusha, but there's also a psychological dimension. And what Lifton does, I haven't got time to talk about it today, unfortunately, but the other thing that Lifton does quite interestingly is extrapolate from his work with the hibakusha to think about the psychological consequences of living in a nuclear age more broadly. And he talks about the difficulties people have thinking about nuclear weapons. He talks about writing in the late 70s, and kind of in anticipation of that proliferation of nuclear protest and nuclear discussion in the 1980s, talks about the politics of trying to challenge the ways in which our brains might, your brains obviously not because you're members of Christian CND, but the ways in which people's brains might shut down in response to nuclear issues, that nuclear weapons challenge what he calls our symbolic immortality, that even when we contemplate our own mortality, which of course is hard enough to contemplate, we have this sense that our family, our friends, humans at least, will continue after us. So there are those modes of remembering, of that sense that something will continue. But it's very hard to imagine a world that doesn't continue, that has lost not only humans, but human ways of making sense of the world. And he talks too about the absence of images of atomic war beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's a different talk, though, or different discussion. This figure of the hibaksha, whether or not it's directly named as that, becomes influential on later writers. For example, this is an example from a very good novel for young adults by a German writer, Gudrun Pausewang, which imagines a Chernobyl-like disaster in Germany and explores the fallout in all the meanings of that term, the radioactive, the social, the economic, the cultural, the personal, and the psychological fallout of a power plant disaster in Germany. The central character, Jana, a teenage girl, comes to recognize herself as a hibaksha. I am a hibaksha, Jana told herself, looking into the mirror in Helga's bathroom and examining herself closely. Yes, even without the bald head, people would be able to see it. In the street, people moved away from her, just as they did from the others in whom they could see the radiation sickness. All those gaps that opened up before her and the rest of those who now, in midsummer, went around wearing caps and headscarves, those curious or compassionate sidelong glances. What I love about Pausewang's novel is that it understands that a nuclear disaster is, there's the material consequences of nuclear explosions or meltdowns, but there are also social consequences and cultural consequences and psychological consequences. We need not look only to fiction, though. The contemporary Marshallese poet, Kathy Jetniel Kajina, writes powerfully about the radioactive legacies of nuclear testing in the Pacific, and particularly on the Marshall Islands, where she was born. I think she now lives in the States. And if people have Wi-Fi, it'd be interesting to see this poem. This is a video poem. So she's a very accomplished poet, but she made a series of her poems that were conceived of as a marriage of video, images and words. And I really recommend, if you just Google her name and Anointed, this will come up, and it's a very good 10-minute watch. And she's writing, her poem is addressed to Ronit Island on Inuiatak Atoll in the Marshall Islands, where there's this dome is containing, not very well, I gather, the slurry from nuclear testing, from the nuclear testing site. And the poem plays with, starts by talking to the island before nuclear testing took place, and then talks about its legacies now. And the people who lived on this island have come back, but may at least be suffering still the damage from the radiological legacy on the island. And she talks about being a mother as well, and she works a lot with the image of there are moments in the film where she kind of cradles her belly, and then she contrasts that with the kind of sterile dome here of the island. You can just see her very small figure there. But this is a poem about being hibaksha, although it doesn't use the word hibaksha. Again, this is just a short excerpt from it towards the end of the poem. I'm looking for more stories. I look and I look. There must be more to this than incinerated trees to this island, a cracked dome, a rising sea. She writes very, very well about climate change as well. A leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more than a concrete shell that houses death. The lack of fence, the anxiety about being unable to contain things crops up in a lot of nuclear literature. Here is a legend of a shell, anointed with power. Latau, this is a sort of folktale locally, used this shell to turn himself, Latau is a kind of trickster god figure, to turn himself into kindling for the first fire. He gave the fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from strands of coconut leaves, from skin and bone, and while the boy cried, Latau laughed and laughed. Here is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is the story of the ways we've been tricked, of the lies we've been told. It's not radioactive anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers, only questions, hard as concrete. What gave them this power? Who anointed them with this power to burn? So the idea of the fire becomes a way of, earlier on in the poem, it's literally the kind of fire of the atomic explosions. Later on, it becomes a way of imagining the ongoing influences of radioactivity, not only in people near the site, but also in subsequent generations. Robert Jacobs, historian at the Hiroshima City University and at the Hiroshima Peace Institute, has done a lot of work linking communities affected in different ways by nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testing. He argues that the category of the hibakusha could be extended beyond those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that it might, for instance, be applied to those displaced from their homes for weapons testing in the Pacific and those who suffered the effects of radioactive fallout there, that it might be used for the downwinders in US states like Nevada of atmospheric weapons testing in the 50s and 60s, that it might apply to service personnel forced to witness nuclear tests and to those described by people like Daniel Cordle in her poem. I'm not sure if I quite agree completely with it, but his description of nuclear testing as being in effect a limited nuclear war is an interesting and provocative suggestion, I think. He points out that during the peak year of nuclear testing, a nuclear weapon was exploded every other day during 1962, and that this idea that the nuclear war that nuclear explosions didn't happen is something to is to be aware that even the testing has its consequences. Another way of thinking of these effects is as what the environmentalist Rob Nixon has called a kind of slow violence. And I really like his book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, because he talks about the ways in which, he's not writing only about nuclear issues and radioactive contamination, but he's writing about generally how environmental effects tends to distribute themselves unequally amongst different types of, amongst different people, and particularly to impact on poorer communities or otherwise marginalized communities. And he draws attention to the fact that we're kind of, our stories are built around very often conflict that is spectacular and quick and encapsulated in a physical struggle of some kind. But the challenge with environmental challenges is that it happens at a slow pace, sometimes much longer than human lives, that you can't as easily depict. And he writes passionately about the role of writer activists in making that violence visible. So people like Daniel Cordle, he doesn't write about her, but we could think about how she makes visible what happened to the Marshall Islands through her writing. And this leads us, this idea of a kind of slow violence and ideas of time, leads us to the final category, which I'll pass over very, very quickly, actually, which are some of the kind of temporal preoccupations of nuclear literature. And I've just sort of summarized different things to think about, I suppose. and different timescales to think about and to think about how our stories, how stories of writers of nuclear literature deal with them. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the first reactions to the Trinity test and to Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they're seen by a lot of writers contemporaneously, not only as kind of moments in the history of nations, but as a key moment in the history of the species. So probably the first nuclear war novel is H.G. Wells' The World Set Free, which predates the atomic bomb by 31 years, but imagines an atomic war. And there Wells describes the history of the human race as one of acquisition of different kinds of energy, and he imagines atomic technologies as capturing the sun. The image of the sun crops up a lot. Or William Lawrence, who was the only journalist present at the Trinity test and was also on one of the observation planes at Nagasaki, wrote the story Dawn Over Zero, the story of the atomic bomb in 1946. And he again sort of makes analogies to the discovery of fire tens of thousands of years before. And so this becomes a momentous moment in all sorts of ways. And so you've got those long periods of time. Of course, you've got that very short moment of the nuclear flash and of transformation. I think one of the disturbing sort of tropes in how we imagine nuclear war is, of course, the idea that it can happen very quickly and things change, that reality jumps onto parallel tracks. But you've also got those kind of medium-term consequences of radioactivity. And what I would love to talk about, but sadly haven't got time, and haven't been able to work it into the slides now. If any of you haven't come across Michael Madsen, not the Hollywood actor, but a Danish film director, this film Into Eternity, and also Robert McFarlane's chapter from his book Underland about Onkalo, which is a place in Finland where they're burying the long-term radioactive waste. That's really worth thinking about for the very long history that we're creating through our nuclear technologies. So Madsen talks about this place that's meant to house the most high-level radioactive waste for 100,000 years. And his film is it's a kind of philosophical investigation into what that might mean. What will it mean to be human in 500 years, let alone 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000? How do we communicate to the future? What kind of level of hubris allows us to do this? And he makes the point that the pyramids are only 5,000 years old. Is this our architecture? Is waste our architecture? It also sort of thinking about time and narrative. I suppose one of the things I've been interested in some of my work is the kind of history of stuff not happening, but the cultural consequences of it not happening. Lots of things happened in the Cold War, lots of nuclear things happened, not least nuclear testing. But the big thing, thank goodness, didn't happen or hasn't happened yet. I'm kind of intrigued with what the impact of that is. And I rather like this cartoon from Douglas Coupland's novel Generation X. Coupland's a visual artist as well as a writer, where characters are haunted. Their kind of lives carry on, and there are just these moments where you realise there is a nuclear context to everyday life. So this character just sees a flash and think, the instantaneous response is, my goodness, it's happened, nuclear war has happened, and then, phew, it was only lightning. But it's a suggestion that there is what Robert Lifton, psychiatrist, called ways in which nuclear consciousness becomes part of the ecology of our minds, becomes something that is in there, is explored by Coupland here and in more detail by the writers. I'll end with another poem, and I'm not going to say much beyond reading this poem out, and then I'll just be interested to learn from you really about your the stories that you tell and the different contexts in which you tell them, and the stories you may find most interesting as well. I have brought with me over there on that table a handout with just lists of it's a reading list. It's quite a long reading list, but there might be some suggestions there. Some of them you'll be familiar with, but there might be some other things that you've not come across before that you're interested in reading. So by all means, take one, and if it provokes you to read something new, then that would be lovely. If you're interested in a copy, you're welcome just to thumb through Bunker. I've got a few copies there for sale for 10 quid, but I'm not here to sell books really, but I've had some free. Let's close with a poem that's partly about the past, but also about the future. This is by Kurihara Sadako, and Kurihara is very good, I think, poet, another survivor of Hiroshima. And this is her most famous poem. It's not my favorite, actually, but I think it's an interesting poem. And it's a scene that she goes back to. This is something that she experienced, though she changes it slightly for the poem. And she talks about the after the atomic bombing in this poem in a way that looks to the future. Night in the basement of a concrete structure now in ruins. Victims of the atomic bomb jammed the room. It was dark, not even a single candle. Smell of fresh blood, the stench of death, the closeness of sweaty people, the moans. From out of all that, lo and behold, a voice. The baby's coming. In that hellish basement, at that very moment, a young woman had gone into labour in the dark without a single match. What to do? People forgot their own pains, worried about her, and then, I'm a midwife, I'll help with the birth. The speaker, seriously injured herself, had been moaning only moments before. And so new life was born in the dark of that pit of hell. And so the midwife died before dawn, still bathed in blood. Let us be midwives, even if we lay down our lives to do so. Thank you.